I just wanted to thank you, first of all, for the invitation to join you. And in doing so, I've spent a fair amount of time reflecting on the theme, that being how we make love a verb. And it's my own belief that we encounter lots of biases and misconceptions that prevent us from loving in the way that we all could and that we should. So it's with that thesis that I will weave in my own life experience, as well as more recently how we bring life into loving at Covenant House in Toronto. I have a half an hour to do so, and I know that I'm standing between you and the food, so I will be very diligent in that regard. But I was thinking back to when I was a kid, and I grew up in a family in a small town in Nova Scotia, where I witnessed a lot of interesting dynamics in the community, a fair amount of pain, a fair amount of suffering, but also some real love and community togetherness. At a very young age, I acquired an appetite for social justice, and I went to King's College in Halifax, and my first summer job was providing recreational support to kids who were living in what is called a locked unit at the Nova Scotia Hospital. And we had the opportunity to take those kids out into community, and many of them had not been outside of the hospital in months. It was incredible. And I thought, oh my goodness, if I could ever give back and do what I'm doing in that situation and actually get paid for it, that would be magic. And it was that really inspired me at a relatively young age to enter the field of social work. My first job at the Children's Aid Society of Toronto, working on the front line, it's clear to me that I had lots of misconceptions in my own mind about who the abused and who the abusers were. And through that experience, very quickly learned that they're not who we think they are. I wanted to acknowledge that biases are natural, that we all hold them, that they're a part of who we are, our life experience, but that they oftentimes prevent us from achieving what we might in life and from embracing that verb called love. So I challenge you to step back as I speak about my journey at Covenant House in particular. I just wanted to start. How many of you are aware of Covenant House? Do you know the program? You know where it is? You know we're situated at the corner of Yonge and Gerrard, and that we're a block away from what I would call the epicenter for homeless youth in Canada. Dundas Square, the Eaton Centre, the bus station, Union Station, and we had very humble beginnings, but over the years we've grown to be the largest agency of its kind, working with homeless, at-risk, and trafficked youth in the country. Since we opened our doors, 90,000 kids have been through those doors. It's incredible. A lot of folks have a sense that, Covenant House is just a shelter, and it's anything but that. We're an incredible city block, 120,000 square feet, and under one roof, a young person has everything that they need to move forward with their lives. So we have a shelter, and 96 young people live in that shelter every single night. Okay? But in addition to the shelter, we have a healthcare service. We have a medical clinic on site that's a partnership with St. Michael's. We have doctors and nurses, psychiatrists. We have a school on site with the Toronto Catholic District School Board. We have counseling. We have a drop-in center that's amazing. There would be upwards of 100 kids who would come into our drop-in center every single day. We have a food bank. We have a clothing bank. We have an employment center on site. We have a program called Cooking for Life, and we're training young people to enter the culinary arts program. And when I describe the work, I often talk about a three-legged stool, because what we do at Covenant House is we stabilize housing, we focus in on employment and education, and then we focus in on what I would call peace of mind and finding the inner spirit. Recently, we've experienced a huge expansion. We now have 28 apartments throughout the inner city of Toronto. 2 of them are actually on St. George Street, just a block away from where I stand. And young people who we've supported through Covenant House get to move into those apartments and actually apply what they've acquired at Covenant House so that they can learn independently. Okay? We've also expanded our programs in the area of mental health and supports for addiction. And in the last 2 years, we've expanded significantly into the area of sex trafficking. And I think that a lot of folks have an image in their heads, again, misconceptions, that victims of sex trafficking are girls from away, that they're not our girls, and it's anything but that. And they're girls just like girls we all know. They're our kids. 90% of the young women who come into the house who have been trafficked are domestic. They're living in Toronto and surrounding area. And it's incredible the impact that that's having in this city. But we've been able to create what I would call a 24/7 response, and we have 2 safe beds at Covenant House. They are filled every single night with victims who are apprehended by the police when these situations are uncovered through criminal investigation. So we've grown incredibly, but if you go back to 35 years, because we're 35 years old, it was actually Cardinal Carter who was very worried about homeless kids in Toronto. And he called upon his colleagues in New York City at the time because he had heard about a program called Covenant House that was about a block away from Times Square. And he also heard that that program was built upon a philosophy of care with unconditional love and absolute respect. So he had those folks come up, they did an environmental scan, and they recommended that we start a program similar to that existed in New York, and the rest is history. There are now 27 Covenant House programs, 16 of them in the US. We have another in Vancouver and 4 in Latin America. And it was Cardinal Carter's vision that has, I think, created the most robust and comprehensive program of its kind in Canada. So on a daily basis, 250 young people coming through our doors. I spend a lot of time dispelling myths. So, back to that theme of misconceptions and the images that we all hold in our heads as to who people are. I spend a lot of time dispelling myths around who homeless kids are. And I think that a lot of folks think that homeless kids are on the street looking for a good time, shirking responsibility, right? It's anything but that. We survey our youth on a regular basis, and we talk to them about what brings them through our doors. And the vast majority of them report that it's actually family dysfunction that took them to the streets. It wasn't poverty. Actually, half of the kids are coming from middle and upper income families. Okay? Poverty is certainly a trajectory once kids are on the street, but that's not what drives them to the street. It's typically family dysfunction. And what am I talking about? I'm talking about abuse, neglect, domestic violence, mental health issues, addictions in the family, reconstituted families, all sorts of dynamics, right? The other interesting fact about our kids is that upwards of 35% of them identify as LGBTQ two-spirited, having been rejected in their own family, in their own community, or bullied in school to the extent that they do not feel safe being there any longer. 35% of our kids are suffering from major mental health, psychiatric diagnosis, medication happening there, as well as addictions. And the drugs that are on the street in Toronto are really, really scary. Crystal meth over the last couple of years has been devastating for our youth, but more recently, fentanyl. And every one of our staff have been trained now to administer naloxone, and over the last month we've had to use it twice. So I'm giving you a picture of a lot of complexity, a lot of pain, a lot of trauma, and a fair amount of suffering. And you get 250 young people together in one place every single day, and there's a lot that happens. I just wanted to point out to you that homeless youth are 40 times more likely to die than our kids. And if you go into what I call the sanctuary at Covenant House, we have up on the wall 50 doves, memorializing the young people that we've known over the time that we've been opened who have lost their lives. 1/3 of them through accidental overdose, 1/3 of them through suicide, and 1/3 of them through homicide. Last week we had an event at Covenant House, and we oftentimes ask our alumni to come back and speak about what brought them to Covenant House and the difference that that program has made in their lives. And I was really inspired by Macy, who came to us after she had lived literally in a park for about 6 weeks. Macy is now registered at Ryerson, learning child and youth work, and actually wants to come back and give back, God bless her, to other kids at Covenant House. It's wonderful. There was a young man, Nick. Nick was trading sex for survival. 30% of our kids, when they're on the street, trade sex for survival. Okay? It's that desperate. And he talked about the incredible shame that he experienced and how he was working through that shame. But it was inspiring because Nick is actually going to be going to law school at U of T. So these are, the images of homeless youth, right? And I think, as you tell their stories and as you touch their lives, you're absolutely blown away. And you also understand how incredible it is that we harbor conceptions of people in the way that we do, and that we all need in order to move on with our own lives and give back and find our own calling to dispel those misconceptions. The other thing I just wanted to mention about our work is that it's risky. We have a very, very strong and tight relationship with the police. If you've ever been to Covenant House, nobody can get into Covenant House with being invited in without being buzzed in. Everything is locked, and that's intentional. Because when a kid comes to the door, they've typically hit a wall. They're afraid, they need to get off the street, and they need to know that the place that they've come to is absolutely safe. In fact, there are 90 cameras that surround the entire property and that are planted in the common areas within Covenant House to deal with anything related to gang activity and to violence that might befall the youth that go there for sanctuary. So with all of that, we apply 5 key principles, okay? And those 5 key principles have been incredibly powerful over the years, and they've driven our work in a way that I think is quite remarkable. The first is Maslow's hierarchy, immediacy. So if you think about the circumstance that I've just described, and by the way, we describe homelessness as no fixed address, so that's very broad. That could be a kid that's been kicked out of home yesterday, it could be a kid that's run away, it could be a kid that's been on the street for days, weeks, months, or years, okay? So it's very, very broad, and the demographic that we're talking about are 16 to 24-year-olds. And these young people are coming from all parts of Canada, okay? Most of them from Ontario, but other provinces and territories, as well as other countries. And we have an arrangement with the Red Cross so that when a young person comes in through the airport and is sponsored but doesn't have anybody to look after him or her, they come to Covenant House, okay? So the principles. The principle of immediacy is when a kid comes through the door, and we're open 24/7, we don't start the conversation with what's wrong. We start the conversation with how can we help you? Are you hungry? Do you want a shower? Are you sleepy? Maslow's hierarchy, food, clothing, shelter, really basic. We do not start a conversation that's intrusive. In a day or two, we start a conversation that goes sort of like this. Bruce, what can we do to help you to move forward with your life? You tell us what you want to do. Is there anybody in your family who you could go back to? And we explore those basics with that person. And out of that, we start to develop what I would call a commitment. That is essentially the covenant. It is a contract, okay? And we create a plan forward. And that plan calls on all those programs that I described to you that are in the house under one roof. the school, the employment program, the counseling, the health care, whatever it is that it takes to move that young person forward with their lives. The second principle that we operate on is sanctuary safety. I've already described to you how important that is, but I can't minimize how critical it is to move forward. When you come into Covenant House, it's got a really interesting vibe. It's very peaceful. We take everything down a notch. It's also incredibly clean. You could eat off the floor. This is not a typical shelter, and that's intentional. We're doing that so that we're showing these kids that they matter, they're respected, and they can rise up. The third principle is communication, relationship, trust, something that is completely foreign to most of these young people because they've not experienced that in their own families, and they've certainly not experienced that on the street. The fourth principle, structure. We have curfews. We have an approach that I would call tough love. We have expectations, and we hold young people accountable. And we lay out some very basic rules like you can't hit other people, you can't bully other people, because those are all the circumstances that have typically brought young people to our doors in the first place, right? And the last one is choice. Choice means they get to decide whether or not they come to us. They've not been forced to come through the door. They've chosen to come through that door. And it's not unusual for a young person to have to come back to Covenant House 3 or 4 or 5 times before they're actually ready to focus in and move forward with their plan. Okay? That's our experience. But when they do, oh my, is it powerful. It's incredible. So with that, I want to go back and revisit the theme. And just remind us all that basically a bias or a preconceived notion is ultimately an unfair prejudice, whether intentional or unintentional, that is based on a lack of information, fear, possible discrimination, and a distancing from what I would call the uncomfortable. And we all know what that means when we pass a homeless person on the street and we awkwardly search our minds and our hearts, and we sort of figure, okay, what am I going to do? Am I going to give this person money? And I'm going to look them in the eye? And am I going to walk past? What am I going to do? I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, how do I manage that situation on the street? And these biases can be quite problematic if we allow ourselves to form our ideas and to let them guide our behavior. So in this state, love becomes what I would call conditional, okay? And I talked to you earlier on about a fundamental principle at Covenant House, which is unconditional love and absolute respect. To provide these young people with an environment that allows for that is life-changing. But in order for that to be applied, we have to dispel our own misconceptions and allow ourselves to think outside of that box. At Covenant House, we start very early in trying to formulate and to inspire different ways of thinking. And, you know, I've got to say to you, 5.5 years ago, before I came to Covenant House, and I was actually approached for the job, I was very happily the CEO of Toronto Community Living, huge agency, 1,200 staff, 80 sites, very busy. I loved it. I was very engaged, and it was with people with an intellectual disability, which I loved. I loved it. And I was approached for Covenant House, and I thought, that's interesting. In my head, I thought Covenant House is just a shelter. How sad is that? And I'm somebody who actually worked in the sector. So they invited me over, and I walked through, and I thought, wow, this is not just a shelter. This is life-changing. So what you wouldn't see at Covenant House is that in addition to what we do at that program with those 90,000 kids that came through that door over the last 35 years, is we have a prevention program, and it goes into schools, and it's called Before You Run. And we have a full-time teacher and a full-time social worker who deliver it to kids in grades 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12. And it's a 60-minute, 90-minute module. And it's very dynamic, interactive, and it basically educates kids about who are homeless kids. They're kids just like the kids in that school. The kids who are living in families that are struggling. They're kids who would feel safer if they weren't in those homes. They're kids struggling with psychiatric issues. They're kids who have been lured by sexual predators. It's all and every one of those things. So we're really focused on that public awareness. The other thing that we've done is we've introduced a program called Trafficked. And that is a program that's gone into schools to target young men and young women around sex trafficking. Who are the victims? What is luring? Where is it happening? And where can you go for help and assistance if you find yourself in that situation? The other thing that I'll just mention to you is that in addition to looking at what I would call prevention, early intervention, and public awareness, we're looking to rally support for systemic policy and legislative changes that could shift the frontier for young people, and one of them being the age of protection for child welfare. It's now 16 in Toronto and Ontario, and that's criminal. It should be much higher, and we've advocated for it to be raised to 18, and in fact it would be better placed at 21. But that's an example of the kind of advocacy that we would also be supporting and advocating for. A couple of last things I just wanted to mention to you, and I'm sorry I didn't realize there were so many of you. I brought along an example of some of our public education material. We are blessed to be working with an advertising firm called Taxi. They're really well known in Canada, North America, and they have adopted Covenant House, and they provide pro bono advertising, marketing, intelligence to our work. They spend days and days with us talking about the work, talking to the youth, and then putting together a campaign that will awaken people's eyes, touch their heads, touch their hearts around the cause. And one of the most successful was a poster that I'm going to circulate. I have 20 of them, and it tells in very, very detailed form. It's a poster that's all writing, like it's just crazy. It's a complete oxymoron when you look at what advertising means to people. People usually want to see one picture and they want a message really quick. But this had huge impact, and it appeared in subways and in bus shelters all over the city, and it was amazing. And basically what it does is it talks about this wonderful kid named Steve. Steve is real. And it talks about why Steve is on the street. Like, it's just mind-blowing. The other one that I'll just circulate too, and we can shoot those around while you're eating and thinking, is a campaign that we launched this Christmas called How Young Do You Have to Be Before People Give a Damn? And it's the image of a young girl, and the young girl turns into a baby. And they're in a bus shelter, and when it's a young girl, nobody stops because she's a young girl. They think, she's up to no good, and looking for a good time, or maybe she's prostituting, God knows what she's doing. But when she turns into a baby, everybody stops. Very interesting. Really thought-provoking. Gets at that whole theme of misconceptions. And when we look at people, what has their journey been? Where have they come from? Why are they here? And what can I do to help them move forward with their lives? So as a next step then, and I have 4 minutes left, I wanted you to think about the misconceptions that you hold, and I hold. We all hold them. How that has affected your behavior. How you may have, unintentionally demonstrated a bias, and as a result, held back on what I would call, showing love, the verb in loving. So I'm asking that you challenge yourself, that you pay greater attention to your own thoughts and behavior, that you put aside your own misconceptions about people and their circumstances, and that you free yourselves up to serve and to find a way forward that will make a difference in our community and in the lives of those who need us.